Hello, everybody, and welcome to the November 2021 Office of Campus Sustainability EcoTalk. Today, we have Professor Barry Lyons with us to discuss making a sustainable living in an Ecuadorian village. So we're excited to have him, and we're also excited to have all of you who have joined us today. Just a few things about the office. So the Office of Campus Sustainability is ran out of Wayne State University, and we work on a lot of different initiatives across campus, sustainable initiatives, and we focus on a lot of education across campus, reaching different stakeholders. So we're excited to have all of you here. This will be posted to our YouTube account, and if you're watching on our YouTube, please feel free to scroll through and see all of our other other Eco Talks. We do host these once a month, and we are very excited to have Professor Lyons today. So without further ado, I will turn it over to him and we will get started with November's EcoTalk.
Okay, thank you, Camille. And thank you for your work in organizing this and spreading the word. And I want to acknowledge also the Sustainability Office. I'm grateful to the Sustainability Office for hosting this. And thank you all for being here. I love talking about these topics with people who are interested, and I'm looking forward to your questions and comments. So I do have an ulterior motive in giving this talk. I'm hoping to interest some of you in this course that I'll be offering this coming semester. What I'll be talking about is actually a key topic in the course. I won't be talking about the course all that much as we go through the hour, but I do want to start with a 50-second video that I've made, just so that if you don't know about the course yet, if you haven't heard about it, you can be thinking about it maybe during the presentation. So let me put that. Come learn about sustainability in a new online course at Wayne State University. You'll talk directly with farmers in South America about the environmental challenges they're facing. We'll show you their fields, and you'll see how farmers around the world might actually help solve climate change. This is what we'll be doing in Anthropology 3600 next semester. All students are welcome in the course. There aren't any prerequisites or language requirements. So please check it out and email me if you have questions. Okay. So I have several goals for this presentation. I want to show how changes in the environment and in agriculture specifically have degraded the local ecosystem, and how these changes have stressed farmers in villages like the one that I'll be talking about, really around the world. I want to persuade you that if we want to understand issues in the environment, and in agriculture, we also have to understand the cultural and social context. We have to see these issues in the context in order to think about potential solutions. And third, I want to explain an approach that I've been learning about to understanding the issues and to addressing them, which goes under the label agroecology. So let me take you on a trip to Ecuador and to this village, which is called San Vicente, in the mountains in Ecuador. So we'll fly and we'll land in this port city of Guayaquil. And then we'll travel over this coastal plain and up the mountains to this area of San Miguel here. We'll pass rice fields, rice processing plants, banana and plantain fields. After a couple of hours, we'll start our way up the mountains. The scenery will will change and it'll get cooler as we go. After a couple of hours, we'll come to an area like this. And this is overlooking that town of San Miguel that I mentioned. There's a close-up. So San Miguel is where, it's a market town. It's where people in the village of San Vicente go to market, and where kids also go to high school. So as we get closer to the village, it'll look like this. And here we are. Welcome to San Vicente. So let me just go back for a moment. So San Vicente is across the river from this market town of San Miguel. It's this whole area here. Oops. I want to introduce you to a couple of people in San Vicente and to one person in a neighboring province. So this is Don Jorge. He's a man in his 40s. My class on Latin America interviewed him last fall over Zoom. And he told us about his life. He told us that he started working in the fields when he was 12 years old. He had to leave school because his parents were poor. He has 3 kids. He has a boy and 2 girls. All of them are studying to be school teachers, and they help him work in the fields on weekends. His family owns a little bit of land, but not enough to meet their needs just farming that land. So they also share crop on other people's land. What that means is that they do all the work, and then they split the harvest 50-50 with the owner of the land. This is a system it's been the system for farming for a long time in this part of Ecuador. It's a system that's rooted historically in centuries of inequality and exploitation. So Don Jorge farms some of his own land, and he sharecrops other people's land. The main crop that he grows on this land, like pretty much everybody in San Vicente, is corn or maize. Partly, he grows corn to feed the family. So corn on the cob and hominy corn, like corn that's harvested in the dry stage and then boiled. That's a staple of the local diet. He'll also sell some of the corn for the family's cash needs. So they'll sell it either as corn on the cob in the fields. Merchants will just buy the field of corn on the cob, or he'll let it dry in the fields and harvest it and sell it later, a sack at a time, as the family needs money. This is Senora Dina. She's a woman in her 70s. She's widowed. She lives alone, or not completely alone, with her cat, Pelucita, and Pelucita. They have a kitten now also. She grew up poor also. She and her husband had a little bit of land of their own, and they sharecropped, similar to Don Jorge. But they did send their kids to high school in San Miguel across the river. And their kids, after going to high school, left the village and left the province to get jobs in other parts of Ecuador. She supports herself now on her own land. She doesn't need to sharecrop anymore. She is not in a physical condition to do all the work herself. So she has day laborers that she'll hire to work the fields near the home. And then she has other people working the land as sharecroppers on some of her plots that are further from home. So in addition to being exploitative for many people, sharecropping is also kind of a form of social security for the elderly. It's a way that elderly people who can't work their own land anymore have an income. This is a young man that I met in the province next door. He's university educated. He's an indigenous activist. He lives in an indigenous Quechua-speaking community. And he he's working to revitalize traditional farming. I'll tell you more about all of that later, but he's never been to San Vicente, but he's part of my story today because the first time that I heard of agroecology was from him. And this is a concept that shapes my thinking and shapes a lot of what I'll be talking about today. So why do stories like these matter? First of all, the overwhelming majority of human beings for the last 10 or 12,000 years have lived as peasant farmers until very recently. It's just in the last couple of decades or so that it's not the majority of human beings in the world. And it's still about 2 people in 5 in the world who depend on farming for a living. So the lives of farmers are just, important for these reasons. But also, agriculture contributes about close to a fourth of greenhouse gas emissions in the world. And the emissions resulting from agriculture are growing. So the crisis that we face in the world today, the ecological crisis, is partly a crisis of agriculture, and it's a crisis of food systems. One reason for the high greenhouse gas emissions associated with agriculture has to do with what's sometimes called the Green Revolution. It's not green in the sense that we use that word today. It really refers to what we more commonly call just conventional farming today. For the last half century and more, farmers around the world have been adopting this kind of technological package that goes under that label, the Green Revolution or conventional farming. It consists of mechanization, for one thing, often, although not so much in San Vicente, a little bit in San Vicente. It consists of improved varieties that are of crops that are bred to do well with synthetic fertilizers and chemical fertilizers. And often those varieties are planted in monocultures. So just one crop and just one variety of that crop for tens of thousands of acres. In the US, probably a lot of states are just taken up by a single variety of corn or soybeans or some other crop. Again, synthetic fertilizers and pesticides are part of the package. And as a result of all of this, the Green Revolution tends to simplify local ecosystems, right? Just one crop. And it tends to degrade local ecosystems, right? Beyond that, in terms of just one crop, but also less biodiversity more broadly. It's also an expensive package. And so it places economic stresses on farmers, especially on the poorer farmers. And these technologies also replace labor. So, it goes back before the Green Revolution. The countryside around the world has been emptying out. People have been going to the cities for centuries in some parts of the world. But the Green Revolution is part of this, and it has accelerated this emptying out of the countryside. So this is part of the ecological crisis. The Green Revolution has contributed to our ecological crisis. And because agriculture is part of our ecological crisis, changes in agriculture also have to be part of a sustainable response to the crisis. So what about San Vicente? How have these global changes played out locally? And what are the prospects for more sustainable livelihoods in San Vicente? Well, I think we have to begin with the fact that San Vicente has seen the same emptying out of the countryside that has happened in most of the world. Most of the young people have left. So when I was in San Vicente as a Peace Corps volunteer several decades ago, the primary school in the village had, I think, close to 100 kids, right, in grades 1 through 6, the main primary school. Maybe more than 100. Nowadays, I think it's like 2 or 3 dozen. So that gives you a sense of the emptying out, especially of young families and kids. San Vicente has lost half of its population or more in recent decades. Most of the people who are still there are elderly, like Senora Dina. There's some parts of the village where there are still young families, but there's dramatic population decline. So what does this mean for agriculture? Well, one thing it means is that there's a labor shortage. Right? There's fewer people to work the fields. That has one consequence that is good, in that sharecroppers are able to negotiate better terms. They still split the harvest 50-50, but the landowner typically puts in more external inputs than they used to have to. They'll pay or share the cost of a tractor. That is one kind of mechanization that has happened in San Vicente. They'll chip in for the chemicals that are also, as I said, part of the package. Another change is that it has to do with the crops that are planted. So these are some scenes that you don't see much anymore in San Vicente now. So you don't see much wheat. Wheat used to be a significant crop. It was rotated with corn in a cycle, but wheat takes more labor than corn. So with less labor available, people just can't plant wheat so much anymore. Another change resulting from the labor shortage is, I alluded to this already, that tractors have replaced human labor and oxen for plowing. As a result of that, there's less need for animals, specifically for cattle. There's also fewer hands to manage the cattle, right, to bring them out to the fields, fewer hands to manage the organic fertilizer that the cattle produce. And herbicides replace manual labor in the way people prepare their plants, in the ways people prepare their fields for planting, right? So I was kind of shocked to see this when we interviewed Don Jorge last fall. What he'd been doing when we started the interview, before the interview, was preparing his field in this way. He's spraying herbicide on it to kill all the weeds. And this is not the way people used to do it when I was a Peace Corps volunteer several decades ago. There. He knows that it's not good for him to be working with these chemicals. It's not good for his health. He says that the chemicals are not good for the taste of the corn. They're not good for the land, but he doesn't see an alternative. Right? I mentioned his kids go to school, and they're just, labor cost $10 a day for a day laborer. That is not a lot of money in American terms, but it's a lot of money for him. So it's more feasible for him to blanket the fields with herbicides. So I want to talk more broadly about some other changes in the environment and in the local agroecology, in the ecosystem surrounding farming. I mentioned the decline in wheat that had to do with labor demands. It's a similar and worse situation with barley. So I had to go back. This was a photo that I took when I was a Peace Corps volunteer several decades ago. The darker fields here are corn. These yellowish fields are either wheat or barley. In the 1980s, barley started to become, you couldn't plant it anymore. There was a fungal disease that just ruined it. And I think the warming of the climate contributes to this, contributes to the conditions that allow that fungal disease to spread. There are areas higher up in the mountains and cooler where people can still grow barley, but not in San Vicente. It's a similar situation with fava beans. In the 1980s, they just started to wilt. The plants just would turn black from some fungal disease. So people used to rotate corn with favas and wheat or barley. They would plant corn one year and fava beans another year and wheat or barley another year. And that is it's a traditional thing that farmers all around the world have been doing for centuries. It's good to maintain the fertility of the soil because fava beans as a legume restore nitrogen to the soil. Corn takes a lot of nitrogen from the soil. Wheat and barley help with the texture of the soil. And also, if you rotate, if you don't plant the same crop year after year, the pests that are specialized in feeding off of that crop die off, right? They can't survive for 2 or 3 years in the same numbers. So rotating your crops helps to control the pests. Without fava beans now, and without wheat and barley, people just more commonly plant corn year after year in the same plot. In addition, farmers in San Vicente, farmers all over Latin America, traditionally have a system of intercropping, which means planting different crops together in the same field. So they would plant pole beans. Here you see these are bean leaves. So they wind their way up the corn stalk, and they help to fertilize the soil for the corn. And the corn helps to support the beans. And they would also, the other crop that people traditionally plant with corn is squash. The leaves of squash get a lot bigger than in this picture, and they'll kind of blanket the ground and help to keep the weeds down that way between the corn stalks. I don't know the reason for this, but beans don't germinate or grow so well anymore in San Vicente, and squash don't either. So, you know, I took these pictures, I think just this past August I was there, but I had to look for a corn stalk with, you know, with beans growing up around it, or with squash nearby. Most of the corn stalks in the fields don't have beans and squash, or don't have a lot, you know, growing around it. Most of the, you know, you'll see one stalk here and there. You don't see a lot of squash growing in between the corn. So without crop rotations and without intercropping, corn is much more of a monoculture in San Vicente. It's the crop that people are dependent on, just exclusively dependent on every year in all of their fields. So turning now to agrochemicals, I've already talked about Don Jorge spraying herbicides, but I want to focus on this a little bit more. I mentioned that there's less organic fertilizer, right? Fewer hands to manage the cattle and to process the manure, fewer hands to take the cattle back and forth to the fields, less cattle around, and also less crop rotations and intercropping to keep the soil healthy. So people have to become more dependent on chemical fertilizers. So they use urea to substitute for the nitrogen that legumes like favas or pole beans could provide. Nonetheless, even so, you hear people saying all the time, the land is tired. The land just doesn't produce as much as it used to, just doesn't do well. People use not only more herbicides, but also fungicides and insecticides. But even so, the pests just seem to proliferate. They talk about it sometimes even in like biblical terms, like the plagues, the 10 plagues. Senora Dina, a few weeks ago, I was talking with her on WhatsApp, and she mentioned that birds do come to her garden. She has a garden by her house with, this is an avocado tree, and she has other trees. And she doesn't spray pesticides in her garden. And she said she really loves to hear the birds singing their morning prayers. Sometimes she said they beat her to it, and once in a while she'll get up earlier and she'll say her morning prayers first. So there are birds that will come to her garden, but there are, she listed half a dozen bird species or more that you just don't see in San Vicente anymore. It seems that some of the birds that you used to see, that used to be more numerous in San Vicente, are birds that ate insects. Like, this is a kind of bird, I don't remember what this kind of bird is called in English. It's called huirachuro in Ecuador. But they eat insects. You still see them once in a while, but not that much. I imagine, and she thinks also, that some of these birds that used to eat the insects have been hurt by the insecticides. She has very strong opinions about using pesticides in general. She talks about herbicides as something that they burn the holy earth, is the way she put it. This is a traditional way of referring to the earth, to the soil. In San Vicente, it's the Santo Suelo, the holy earth. And she's, in saying that, she's referring to the scene of the plants on the ground, on the soil, just blackening after someone sprays the herbicides. They die and they turn black, and she sees that as just like burning the earth. So an example of my point about how cultural ideas play into the people's attitudes about this, and maybe can offer some encouragement or some ideas about solutions. And it's not that people love insecticides or herbicides. Economically, I alluded to this already, chemical inputs are expensive and they don't always pay off, especially for a sharecropper like Don Jorge, who's doing all the work, and he's paying typically half of the inputs, so that the cost of the insecticides and herbicides and synthetic fertilizers and all of that. But he's only getting half of the harvest. So Don Jorge kind of broke down the numbers for us when he was interviewing, when we were interviewing him in my class last fall, and saying that sometimes he breaks even, sometimes it's worse than that. Sometimes he doesn't even break even. So this is a real crisis for farmers. And one of the reasons that I decided to focus the field school work, the course next semester on these issues, is that people like Don Jorge and other people that we interviewed kept asking. We had a local, like a field school coordinator last year who arranged for the interviews, and he told me that people kept asking him, well, are they going to help in some way with farming, with our agriculture? Is there some way that we can help? And what they seem to mean by that in the short term is, can we contribute some of the expenses for the urea that they have to buy? Or can we set up some system where they might have loans to purchase fertilizer? In the long term, my hope is that we can help them think about other longer term, more sustainable solutions. So what are some of the prospects? What are some of the potential solutions? I want to first say that despite all of these problems, I don't want to give the impression that people in San Vicente or farmers anywhere are just passive victims. There's lots of local knowledge. And a lot of what I've been saying draws on things that people have told me. It's not just, my own analysis. Like small farmers anywhere, they're the experts on their environment. They're the experts on their situation. They're the experts on what might work. And they also are continually experimenting with potential alternatives. So here, Senora Dina, this is in the middle of two cornfields in her land, and she's planted some peas. Pole beans don't do so well anymore. Favas are in trouble. Peas are another legume that can help to restore nitrogen to the soil. In some plots, when I was there in August, we saw people planting peas in between the corn stalks. So there's lots of local experimentation, lots of creativity. And the home gardens are a site for a lot of this experimentation and creativity. So she's found, I showed you a picture earlier of an avocado tree. She's found that avocados that used to not be something that you could grow this high up in the mountains, a few years ago, they started producing. I'm not sure that that's necessarily, long-term a good solution on a large scale. There are a couple of the wealthier farmers in San Vicente who've been experimenting with growing avocados, with planting whole fields in avocados. But that requires having the means to take a field out of production for a few years until the avocados start producing. It's also dependent on export markets, so it's risky. But my point is that people are experimenting with all kinds of different options. And it may be that climate change creates some new options as well as creating problems. But what I'm really, I guess, more excited about is a frame for thinking about all of these options, for thinking about local experimentation, an approach for thinking about how people might try out different solutions. And that's what I refer to as agroecology. So again, this is Gustavo Tenesaka. He's an indigenous activist in a village in the province next door. And he's talking in this interview with him, he's talking about how he and his dad, who managed this field, they planted some native species of trees in the middle of the field here and around the borders. And he explained that this creates a kind of microclimate that buffers some of the extremes of the weather. So it's more common nowadays as an effect of climate change that it's unseasonably dry and sunny and hot. And he's seen that his neighbor's potato plants, or in the neighboring plant, might wilt in the sun, but with the microclimate created by the shade of the trees, their potato plants do better. There's also, as an effect of climate change, frost might fall out of season. So in the old days, they could predict when it would frost, and they would schedule their planting around that so that the plants weren't vulnerable to the frost. But nowadays, a frost might come when the plants are, unpredictably, when the plants are vulnerable to it. But again, the trees, he said, buffer that. So his crops are protected from the frost. So that's part of this agroecological approach. It also involves recovering some aspects of traditional farming. So they experiment with organic methods of controlling pests, for example. The basic idea is that they want to restore a healthy ecosystem. It's not just rewinding the clock and using traditional methods to do that, though. It's also using new methods that they haven't used traditionally. So, for example, they have an enormous compost bin on the edge of this field. That's not something that people in this part of Ecuador traditionally did. They didn't compost, but they've learned to do it, and they've learned that can also help restore the ecosystem and the fertility of the soil. Agroecology is also a way of learning and a way of sharing knowledge. It involves collaborations between farmers and agronomists and other participatory researchers, maybe anthropologists. It involves dialogues among farmers. So he sees it as part of his role to share knowledge and to teach other farmers what he's learned in his fields. This movement, farmer to farmer, or campesino a campesino, arose in Central America as a response to the failures of the Green Revolution, the failures of conventional agriculture. And farmers learned to carry out really rigorous scientific experiments in their plots. So they would have a plot where they would farm with the conventional methods that they've been using in recent years, and next to it another plot or another section of the plot, experimenting with some different method. So they'd have these controlled experiments, and they'd see how it worked. And every farmer in a community, or a few dozen farmers in a community, might be carrying out different experiments in their fields, and then they'd pool what they'd learned from these experiments and spread it to other farmers in their village and neighboring village. So it's a way of generating knowledge that doesn't depend just on the agricultural research institutes that every country in Latin America and around the world probably has these agricultural research institutes, but they tend to be much more oriented towards conventional farming. So this is a way to generate a different kind of knowledge, really cutting edge knowledge of how to farm sustainably and how to generate that knowledge in the hands of farmers. Some of the agroecological methods require a pretty heavy investment of labor, at least initially. So this is an issue. This is an obstacle given the way the countryside has emptied out, as I said earlier. it's also an issue because the governments in Ecuador and around the world have subsidized conventional agriculture. So they subsidize tractors, they subsidize agrochemicals, but they don't subsidize agroecology. So to make this transition possible, agroecology is also a social movement that's working to change those structural barriers and to demand support from the governments to make a transition to agroecological methods, to make a transition to more sustainable rural livelihoods. Agroecology is also an academic discipline, an interdisciplinary field of research. Some of the fundamental insights that I've gleaned from this field that kind of sum up some of the things that I've been saying about San Vicente are that, first of all, the farmer's field, it's not like a factory assembly line. Right? So we might think of factory production as linear, right? There's inputs that you put in the raw materials, and you get a product out at the end of the line. Agriculture is not like that. Agriculture is, the farmer's field itself is a complex ecosystem. It's an ecological system with circular flows and causal loops. So, it's not linear, like you can just put in the chemicals and you get the product and that's the end of the story. There are causal loops. So what you do one year affects the field the next year. This is partly because the farmer's field is embedded in a larger ecosystem. And that larger ecosystem includes the neighboring fields, it includes the trees around the field, it includes the birds that perch in those trees and that maybe eat the insects that attack the crops, some of them. So a healthy ecosystem provides what biologists call, or agronomists call, ecosystem services. So for farmers, those ecosystem services are regenerating the soil. This is an ecosystem in the soil that helps to process the organic matter and make it available, make the nutrients available to the plants. So there are soil microbes that do that. A healthy ecosystem provides services that also include controlling the pests. Right? There's a balance between predators and pests. Conventional agriculture substitutes external inputs for those ecosystem services. And when it does that, it often actually ends up degrading those ecosystem services in the process. So that's what's happening when insecticides are controlling the insects in the short term, but they're also killing the birds that eat those insects. So you don't have the birds to control the insects anymore. It's what's happening when synthetic fertilizers kill off the beneficial soil microbes and change the pH of the soil. And so you don't have this healthy soil ecosystem creating or making nutrients available to the plants, and you become more dependent on those inputs. So the vision of agroecology is to design agriculture to be part of a healthy ecosystem where you maintain those ecosystem services and you don't depend on external inputs. My aim in San Vicente is, first of all, to learn more in San Vicente about the local issues and to learn about what farmers there see as their priorities, to learn about their ideas for responding to the problems that they have, and to participate in a dialogue, in a kind of participatory research that can help generate viable responses. How are we doing for time? Okay, so I think I'm going to skip this video. This is another little video about the course. Maybe I'll play it for you at the end if you're interested. But I want to be sure to leave time for, oops. I want to be sure to leave time for questions or comments. So the floor is open. Thank you for being here, and I'm eager to hear your questions and comments and talk about all this with you.
Absolutely. Thank you for that fantastic discussion. I guess I didn't really know that agroecology was really a word, and so it's interesting to learn more about it and kind of put it into the perspective of the storytelling aspect that you gave us with everybody that you've met along the way in kind of learning about this. So that was really interesting. I do have a few questions, but I want
Sure.
Anybody else has questions, feel free to put them in the chat or unmute yourself. So I guess my first question would be, how did you get involved and get interested first in San Vicente? I know you had mentioned that you worked with the Peace Corps. Is that where you first?
Yeah. So that was my first encounter with San Vicente. I was there for 2 years when I was just out of college. And my connection to San Vicente goes back to that. Actually, my wife is from San Vicente, so I have close connections.
I see. Okay.
We go back whenever we can.
And so you've been kind of traveling back and forth to do the study on the agroecology there? Yeah,
well, I haven't really been focusing on this. I did my doctoral research as an anthropologist in the province next door, and I wasn't really focused on these issues. It's really just recent. I've been hearing from my in-laws and from other people in San Vicente for years about about some of the agricultural problems, but I haven't had a chance to really focus on it and kind of return to San Vicente with a focus on agriculture that I had in my Peace Corps years until now, really.
Absolutely. I may have missed this earlier in the discussion, but you had said that there was a transition between the way of farming that they used to do and this conventional farming in Ecuador. About when was that transition, would you say? Yeah, it's hard to put a date on it because, like, when I was there in the 1980s, people were already using some chemical synthetic fertilizers and a little bit of pesticides. And they haven't, they've never like bought in full, like wholesale to the Green Revolution or conventional agriculture, everybody, but they've become gradually more and more dependent on it, like over the decades since the 1980s. Or probably started before. I mean, I just say the 1980s because that's when I was there first. So yeah, I mean, it's been a sort of gradual process, and that's typical of like peasant farming communities around the world. They're not like large farmers who've in the US or in other parts of Ecuador sort of adopted whole scale like large monoculture fields, but it's been a gradual process. Yeah, I'm sure it has been, across the world. Conventional farming has been kind of, at least all that I've ever really known about the American farming industry. And I know that that's changing slowly but surely now with new information kind of coming out about the harmful effects of pesticides. And like you had mentioned, soil fertility has just plummeted.
Yeah, we're losing topsoil. Every year the world and the United States too the topsoil is just blowing away or washing away.
Yeah, it's terrifying, really. And I know that we had mentioned, you had mentioned it briefly with Don Jorge's video about him spraying the pesticides. So have you looked into at all how health has been impacted in this area as a result of these conventional farming ways with the pesticides?
Yeah, not systematically, but he himself mentioned that, and someone else that we talked to last fall mentioned that people have died from pesticide poisoning. I know that there have been studies in other parts of Ecuador that show that even a lot of children have high levels, or mother's milk has high levels of pesticides in it, and children have high levels in their bodies, and yeah. So I mean, I think I think in this study that I'm thinking of in northern Ecuador, neurological effects on kids too. So yeah, it's not good. But no, I haven't studied it in any systematic way in San Vicente.
Okay, yeah, I was just asking. I know that that's been a big issue. I guess a big topic.
Yeah, good question. I mean, that is something that would be interesting to learn more about if we can in this course next semester.
Yeah, absolutely. Does anyone have any other questions for Professor Lyons before he? I would love to see the video as well, if there's time. Okay.
No questions right now. Okay, well, I could go back to that slide and yeah. So this is also just 50 seconds. Another, and this is based on the kind of the pilot field school that we did as part of a different class last fall. I've been talking about.
I just want to thank you for giving your time to educate our students.
We always talk about cultural differences, but I feel like I learned a lot of our similarities.
Pero siento que he aprendido de ustedes. Okay, so any last chance for questions? I see someone has said something in the chat. Okay, Jacob says, I don't think my mic is working, but I want to say thanks. Thank you for being here, Jacob.
Yeah, and thank you to everybody who had jumped on. Thank you, Professor Lyons, for joining us and for giving us an insight into kind of the way of life in San Vicente, and I look forward to hearing more about your class, and I hope that the next upcoming semester goes well. And
thank you.
And yeah, thank you so much for having it. We're glad to have you, and we're glad to have everybody here on behalf of the Office of Campus Sustainability. You can, if you're interested in getting involved with the Office of Campus Sustainability, we are on Instagram and YouTube at Warrior Sustainability, and we're online at sustainability@wayne.edu. We'd love to connect with you guys. And thank you all so much again for being here.
Let me just acknowledge also before we go. Of course, I'm grateful to the people of San Vicente and Ecuador, and to the administration of Wayne State for supporting the project. I have colleagues at Wayne State and other schools, U of M, Ecuador, who've shown a lot of interest in it, and who've shared some of their insights in the project. thank you also to the students who participated in the pilot field school course last fall, and to my friends and family who've contributed, and to all of you here. I'm really happy to be talking about all this with you. Thanks for coming.